à tous. Merci de votre participation. Pour écouter notre session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour, habari za leo. My name is Kevin Mutia.
Solofina Nekesa.
Lauren Arnza.
Ryan Fisher, Professional Officer at ICLE Africa. On behalf of ICLE Africa, the African Centre for Cities, our future cities, and partners, I'm excited to welcome all of you to the Rise Africa 2021 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing as a platform of thinkers, doers, enablers, committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
Rise Africa is about building active networks across academia, government, private sector, civil society, and the arts.
Our entry point is based not on articulating problems followed by proposing solutions, but rather on celebrating our cities as places of innovation and culture, while asking what more we can do to make them sustainable, inclusive, and vibrant.
This festival is hosting 46 sessions over 5 days from across 16 countries in Africa and the world. Every session aims to share new ideas, showcase ongoing actions, and launch new initiatives by bringing participants together to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you to commit to one or more specific actions that you or your organizations will take on. As this session closes, you will be redirected to a survey in which you can articulate these actions. We will follow up on this committed action throughout the year and offer resources, connections, and support. In this way, we are testing the idea that events can galvanize action, and we hope that you will join us in this effort.
Beyond this session, there are many ways to take part in the festival.
Register for further sessions.
Vote for your favorites in the photo competition.
Test your knowledge of African cities from our daily quiz.
Watch a variety of inspiring video provocations.
And listen and dance to the Rise Africa 2021 playlist.
We hope that you will make all attempts to reach out to new people and build lasting connections.
Before we begin, it's important to note that this session is being recorded and that by participating, you are consenting to be recorded. All recordings will be available on the program page after the festival.
Creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities. So we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming.
1. When people ask me where I'm from, I tell them, I am from red dirt and green hills, endless mango trees whose small sun of a fruit is always within arm's reach, smells so sweet your stomach speaks in small roars of impatience as you sip your cup of chai waiting for meals to finish cooking. I am from the sounds of my people, languages so rhythmic you think we spoke in song, the melodies of matatu conductors waving on crowded city streets, and the crow of roosters calling the sun from behind the horizon in the village. 2. When people ask me where I am from, I tell them, I am from a country mispronounced into modernity by wandering white men, from big men with small minds who stole the spoils of our struggles with no shame or foresight. I tell them I come from those who resisted, those whose dreams defied their bullets even after their breath was stolen from their bodies. 3. When people ask me where it is I'm from, I tell them I am from a new story about this country, this continent, this world, a new tale told by new authors, unafraid to wield the pen as a small spear, our ancestors as shield, our history as armor, as we use our words to help write this world anew.
So, a warm welcome to our session, Learning from and Across African Cities, Emancipatory Pedagogies for Transformative Change. My name is Julia Vesely, and together with Adriana Allen, Yolanda Handler, and Getika Anand, I have the huge pleasure of hosting this session today. Before we get into it, I just want to make sure that everyone settles in well and gets an idea of who else is in the Zoom room. So I'd ask you to click on your participant tab and rename yourself so you can see each other's full name, where we're all connecting from today, and perhaps add your affiliation and organization as well. We're also keeping a close eye on the chat throughout the workshop, so please feel free to introduce yourself there, to share any comments, any questions, or your own experiences with learning practices there. The workshop will have speakers in French and in English, so whenever you require translation, just go to the interpretation channel at the bottom of your screen. So yesterday in the opening session of the Rise Africa Festival, Edgar Peterson from the African Center for Cities outlined that this festival is about marshalling collectively people's agency, creativity, and ingenuity, which are fundamental to respond to and transform the deep systemic challenges which many African cities are facing. What we're looking at and reflecting on in this session is, in a nutshell, what are actually the learning practices that are activating and enhancing this agency, creativity, and ingenuity in different urban practitioners, and which key principles and qualities are these learning practices built upon. That's what we refer to here as emancipatory pedagogies, the learning practices that are building and nurturing the agency of individuals and collectives, that are strengthening the capacities and skills of grassroots organizations, of social movements, of researchers, everyday city makers, and others to transform their own reality. So we're clearly not talking about learning as a transaction of expert knowledge, but about horizontal practices which value co-learning and challenge prevalent hierarchies in urban planning and practice. And when I say we, then I have to be explicit about, the two kind of angles that we're coming to at this session. So on the one hand, it's the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, or KNOW program, which is a 4-year research and capacity building program working across 12 cities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And with the African partners of KNOW at RD University, at Makerere University, and the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center, we've been organizing workshops and conversations to speak to the challenge of reinventing planning education in African cities, and particularly in higher education spaces, but without reinventing the wheel. So really, as this festival spirit also is about, recognizing the many innovative projects and programs that exist, but without turning a blind eye on the profound qualitative and quantitative shortfalls that continue to deepen inequalities in education and practice. So from the perspective of KNOW, the festival really is a very welcome and wonderful opportunity to continue our regional conversation and to move forward on discussions on collective and disruptive educational practices. And this time reflecting particularly how higher education institutions can learn from, can work with the pedagogies of urban practitioners in social movements and grassroots organizations. And that's where co-hosting with the Habitat International Coalition, or HIC, becomes an incredibly rich and fruitful and wonderful encounter. So HIC is an international collective of civil society organizations, of social movements, individuals that mobilizes and advocates in defense, promotion, and enforceability of the human rights of homeless, evicted, displaced, landless, and inadequately housed people and communities. And KNOW and HIC have recently established a collaboration, which Yolanda will talk about later, on developing so-called co-learning spaces, which will bring together members across regions to learn together and strengthen collective action related to habitat rights. So as you can see in the program, we have an amazing group of speakers and discussants from HIC and KNOW and other invited colleagues and friends who will share their experiences and who we asked to reflect on 3 questions. Why and how did your learning practice emerge? What changes were generated as a result? And what are, in your view, the key qualities in this learning practice that make it emancipatory? And we will introduce speakers and discussants and explain the different blocks you can see as the workshop progresses. And we really encourage you also to extend that conversation into the chat by contributing your own experiences, reflecting on what has been said, or anything else that you want to share there. The final part of the session will be dedicated to collectively read across those experiences and to reflect and distill on your own learning practices, to then come up with key qualities or principles of emancipatory pedagogies, which we want to develop into a pamphlet and which will be shared with all interested after the session. So what we really hope is that the session provides an impetus for you in your organization, in your institutions, to perhaps spark conversations about learning practices and how they are or could become emancipatory. And before we're diving into presentations and discussions, now inviting Getika to read a poem by Tracy Martin, which was published in the Barefoot Guide on Learning Practices in Organizations and Social Change.
Thanks, Julia. What is learning? It's not a package tied with string or a machine with precise instructions. It doesn't obey rules or masters. No one can patent it, though many have tried. It's never been captured and bottled, or dissected, defined, or delivered. It has many colors and scents, many flavors and textures. It can speak in every language. And every time people tell a story and others give their whole selves to listening, it can happen. And every time someone asks real questions and honors unexpected answers, then acts on them, it happens. It's out there in the field, waiting for you, like a juicy red fruit, or a pale blue flower, or the raindrop you can catch in your hand because you watched as it fell. Thank you so much.
Now I'm going to hand over to Yolanda Handler to introduce the different speakers and moderate the presentation and discussions.
Sure, thank you so much, Julia. A very warm welcome to you all, and happy Africa Day. I've been seeing some Africa Day congratulation messages in the chat. Really wonderful to have so many people joining us. I am going to give a brief overview of the program and particularly the different sections that we are going to be walking through together. You will have seen that there are three broad sections in which we'll be exploring learning practices and where we'll be asking what makes these learning practices emancipatory. And the first area that we have asked our speakers to look at is activism-related learning practices. And the second one refers to social mobilization. And the third area of learning practices is on advocacy and policy change. And while the three are quite interlinked, and it's not, and one can by no means completely separate them, how we have defined activism-related learning practices is specifically those learning practices that focus on more targeted catalytic pedagogies for community leaders and individuals. Then social mobilization refers to learning practices at scale, which target collective or community-wide processes. And then learning practices on advocacy and policy change are ones that foreground the eventual impact that is had in mind. So that's just to give you a broad framing of how we've grouped the various presentations. As Julia has mentioned, we've asked each speaker to speak to the three questions around their learning practice that was shared on the slide before. And once we've heard from each speaker, we will have a discussant responding to these presentations and particularly keeping in mind what are some of the key qualities that make these learning practices emancipatory. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers for our first block, which is learning practices related to activism. Our first speaker is from the Development Action Group based in Cape Town, South Africa. His name is Akona Siswana, who is a project coordinator and plays a central role in facilitating the Active Citizens Training Program, which is also what he will be presenting about. And I will introduce our second speaker then just before the next presentation. Akona, a very warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yolanda. If I could just quickly share my screen, you will tell me if you're able to see it. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Greetings, everyone. As you have heard, my name is Akona Siswana. So I'm going to be speaking about the Active Citizens Training course or the Active Citizens Training Program. So just to give a brief background in terms of South Africa, with our history of apartheid, which has brought rise to the current social and spatial inequalities that we are seeing in Cape Town, you will find that the majority of our residents are still languishing in poverty with limited access to basic services and infrastructure such as water and sanitation, and also just dignified housing. And with the current economic climate as well, this means that these people are also faced with the day-to-day challenges of not knowing what they're going to eat at the end of the day. And this also now brings a rise to their despondency, because also the government is very slow in servicing the people. And at times they often struggle with their role within the community in terms of how to bring their issues or their challenges forward to the government. And in response, every time their response is the same, going to the streets to protest and disrupting the infrastructure that is already challenged and limited. So that is their only way to express their frustration on the limited, on the slow pace of service delivery. So having identified that gap, Development Action Group as an organization, we decided to provide a leadership training course or a capacity building training course that is aimed at these struggling communities. And what I think underpins our training course is this issue-based organizing and co-creation of solution. Now, what is contained in our course? So I'll just run briefly through that. So, like I said, these communities are despondent, they are poor, they're languishing in poverty. And we thought the first thing to identify here is how do they relate to their constituency? So the way we have crafted this training course is that the first module looks at the leaders as individuals. What are some of these tools that these leaders can use to give feedback to their communities? Because one of the issues that we have is that our local government, our provincial government, and even national government is not accountable to the people. People do not have the information. They are not participating in the processes around projects that are coming to their communities. So there's this issue with accountability. There are other issues with corruption and as you might have seen with the commissions of inquiry and stuff like that. So we felt the first point to start, because these people are also struggling with their role within the communities, is for them to understand themselves in relation to their communities as leaders. So what are some of these tools that they can use? So those are the feedback tools and also the Johari's windows, the tools that we are using so that people can understand themselves in relation to others. And also how do they begin to set objectives and goals for their communities. We often talk about SMART goals, goals that are specific, measurable, that are attainable, that are reachable, that are time bound. So that is what we deal with in the first module, the individual as a leader. And then once we're done with the individual, once they understand themselves and how they relate to others, we talk about knowing your organization. What are some of these key elements that are needed in order for your organization to function? In order for your community to function, what do you need? What are some of these, the issues of identity, the issues of culture? So we deal with that also as well in our first module, know yourself as a leader, and then know your community. And then the module number 2 now looks at, know your organization, sorry. Then module number 2 looks at knowing your community. That is where now you'll find us talking about asset-based community development. How do you begin to look at your community and recognize that your community is a resource? What are some of the assets that are there in terms of mapping your assets, assets of individuals, assets of organizations, assets of institutions? So we're saying to these community leaders, you are a resource as a community. There are assets within your community. You know your community better than anyone. So what are some of these tools that you can use? And asset-based community development underpins that particular process. And then also under social scoping tools, in terms of understanding your community, who is there, profile your community profiling. How many people, how many crashes? So in this module, we're dealing with knowing your community so that you can surface issues that are felt by the whole community. The whole question of enumerations, social audits, understanding how your community survives in terms of their livelihoods. How do you as a leader do a livelihoods assessment of your communities? What are some of these vulnerabilities that your community members are vulnerable to? What are some of the challenges to the livelihoods of your community? So we deal with that, trying to understand your community. And then once people understand their community and are able to surface these issues that are felt by the whole community, then we move on to the third module that deals with how government works. what are some of these different spheres of government, so that they don't go out to the streets and protest and burn a local councillor's house, whereas that particular need sits with the national government. So how government works, what are some of these roles and responsibilities of each sphere of government? How do you then begin to understand how the City of Cape Town budgeting process works? Where are the opportunities for you to participate in that budgeting process? Where are the opportunities for you as a community to influence that budgeting process of your municipality? So we're dealing with how government works now, so that they can understand that this issue relates to that, the issue that we're facing relates to something else. And then in terms of the last module, that is where now we're talking about sustainable communities. What defines a sustainable community? What needs to be there in terms of vibrant life, economic opportunities, a viable public transport system, schools for your children, social amenities and stuff like that. What defines that? And who sits at the center of power in trying to resolve that, so that communities also understand the power dynamics within their communities, within their neighborhoods, citywide power dynamics and national power dynamics in terms of the country. And that's where we deal with this theory of advocacy and lobbying. Once you understand the power dynamics, then how do you then design an advocacy campaign? How do you design a community action plan? And as you can see, this process is linear like that. Then in between these training courses, these modules, there are one-day workshops that we run with the communities on key contextual issues. For example, now in Cape Town, one of the key contextual issues that we're talking about is these district plans. These district plans inform how the city will deliver projects within our communities for the next 10 years. So they are reviewed every 10 years. So we need to bring that conversation to our communities so that they can understand exactly what is happening, how they can influence these processes. And where have we seen the impact of this in terms of communities on the ground? Remember, our approach is around influencing the thought process, perceptions, how the language now that the people speak, and in terms of the actions now that they take. They're no longer using one tactic in terms of going to the streets. They are now able to articulate their issues, even on boardroom situations, something that was not there before. So through this course, we're able, but it's not an easy thing because some of the results, we don't see them immediately. So it requires us to be patient in terms of monitoring, in terms of the change in action, the change in thoughts, the change in perceptions. So you often have to sit with the communities and monitor the progress. And some of the challenges, of course, is the fact that this work is voluntary. These people are leaders within their communities. They're not getting paid. They are voluntary because they can see the need to stand up. And they are also faced with daily bread and butter issues. So now you're dealing with one community leader.
May I ask you to come to a close in the next...
Thank you, London. So in terms of the impact, we've seen the change in agency. People are now able to take ownership of their projects on the ground, and in terms of understanding which sphere of government deals with what. And in terms of the language, I think that is very important for me, the language, because it becomes the barrier when they have to communicate with government officials. So I think we are also supporting these communities on live projects through our other project called Social Technical Support, but we can speak to this sometime. Yeah. So let me just end there, Yolanda, for now.
Akona, thank you so much. Fascinating stuff. We'll be speaking more about that later, I'm sure. Our second speaker is Daniel Nonse. Bienvenue. Daniel is based in Cameroon, and he is the general coordinator of programs at an organization which is called ASOAL. And Daniel will be speaking to us about building capacities to resist evictions through popular tribunals. If you don't speak French, I will ask you to switch to the English interpretation channel, as Daniel will be holding his presentation in French. Daniel, the floor is yours. À vous.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Allô? Allô? OK. Bonjour à tout le monde. Il m'a été demandé d'entretenir les participants à ce festival du rôle du tribunal populaire des élections dans le processus de lutte pour le respect du droit au logement. En fait, le tribunal populaire des élections est un élément du dispositif mis en place par l'Association nationale pour lutter contre les évictions forcées qui s'appelle le balcon de droit. Alors, pourquoi ce tribunal a été initié? Parce qu'à un moment, depuis plus de 10 ans, il y a un problème lié à la violation du droit au logement. Il y a des difficultés d'accès au logement. Et à côté de ces difficultés d'accès au logement, nous avons un nombre croissant des évictions forcées qui sont occasionnées soit par l'État pour des problèmes structurants ou pour des projets d'utilité publique, soit aussi par des particuliers ou des gens qui ont des projets d'accaparement des terres. C'est aussi à cause des difficultés d'accès à la justice, au conseil juridique et à l'information par des populations que le tribunal populaire des évictions a été initié. Donc, alors, concernant la mise en comment la pratique d'apprentissage se déroule, il faut dire qu'il y a une phase préparatoire qui consiste à identifier les communautés victimes ou potentielles victimes des évictions. Parfois, c'est les communautés qui nous sollicitent. Parfois aussi, c'est nous qui allons vers les communautés pour identifier. Alors, dans ces communautés-là, nous allons procéder d'abord à la sensibilisation parce que parfois, les gens souffrent sans se rendre compte qu'ils sont en train de souffrir. Donc, on va sensibiliser les communautés. Et après la sensibilisation, nous allons passer à l'identification des leaders qui existent dans ces communautés. Ces leaders-là, nous allons mettre en place un programme de formation qui va leur permettre de s'impliquer à toutes les étapes du processus d'accompagnement que nous allons dérouler. Puis suivant la documentation des cas. Et la documentation, quant à elle, il s'agit d'aller dans la communauté, collecter toutes les informations liées à chaque cas identifié. C'est-à-dire l'historique, comment le problème est arrivé et qui en est à l'origine, qu'est-ce qui a été fait avant notre arrivée et qu'est-ce qui est envisagé. Après la documentation de cas, nous allons passer à la réalisation des enquêtes sociales pour voir l'impact que les évictions peuvent avoir sur les communautés au cas où ça arrivait. Après la réalisation des enquêtes sociales, nous allons passer à la réalisation des cartes participatives pour mettre sur un document tout l'existant de la communauté. C'est-à-dire que si c'est un quartier, on va mettre sur une carte tout ce qui existe sur la communauté pour prévoir, pour pouvoir appuyer, n'est-ce pas, le plaidoyer qui sera déroulé après. Et maintenant, parce qu'on a besoin que la communauté soit organisée, nous allons accompagner la communauté dans la structuration. C'est-à-dire que de la communauté, on va passer au collectif, qui sont une sorte d'association qui devrait porter, n'est-ce pas, le plaidoyer. Après la phase préparatoire, nous allons passer à la phase de mobilisation des personnes ressources, parce qu'un tribunal, c'est un certain nombre de personnes qu'il faut mobiliser. Donc, il s'agit des avocats, des huissiers de justice, des parajuristes que nous avons aussi formés, des leaders de la société civile, des leaders religieux et autres leaders communautaires. À cela, nous allons ajouter des institutions de justice privée et publique et les autorités dont le cas touche. C'est-à-dire que si on se rend compte que c'est un ministère quelconque qui porte un projet qui va faire à ce que les populations soient déguerpies, nous allons le convier à la rencontre. Par la suite, nous allons constituer le tribunal en lui-même, dont, c'est-à-dire les juges, les greffiers, les avocats, les huissiers, ainsi de suite, que nous allons constituer dans l'équipe qui va conduire le tribunal jusqu'à la fin. Et nous allons préparer aussi toute la documentation nécessaire à la présentation de chaque cas et préparer les communautés quant à leurs différentes interventions. Parce que lors du tribunal, il sera question, d'introduire d'abord les faits, et de permettre aux communautés de s'exprimer sur leur situation. Parce que comme l'accès à la justice est difficile, c'est souvent rare que les gens aient l'opportunité d'aller parler même de leurs propres problèmes. Parce que parfois, il va arriver qu'il n'y ait personne pour les écouter. Donc, après la phase de mobilisation des personnes ressources, qui va prendre en compte aussi des moments de préparation des intervenants, même les juges, nous allons passer à l'organisation du tribunal en lui-même. Alors, le jour J, chaque communauté est appelée à présenter et à défendre son cas devant les juges qui ont été installés. Les accusés, si on arrive, lorsqu'on arrive à les mobiliser, sont aussi là pour apporter des réponses aux différentes préoccupations des juges et des communautés. À la fin du tribunal, des recommandations sont adressées aux différentes parties incriminées selon le niveau de faute. C'est-à-dire que on va rédiger une déclaration, comme j'ai partagé avec vous un exemple de déclaration. Et à l'intérieur de cette déclaration, nous allons interpeller toutes les personnes qui peuvent avoir quelque chose à faire dans le tribunal des élections. Il faut dire que la dernière session a eu lieu en 2009 à Douala. C'est un tribunal qui peut se déplacer d'une ville à l'autre. Alors, sur les changements qui ont découlé, qu'est-ce qu'on a eu comme principal changement? Nous pouvons noter le nombre important de communautés qui s'engagent à dénoncer les cas de violation de leurs droits, quels que soient les auteurs, parce qu'avant, puisque les gens ont peur de la justice, si c'est le cas, au début, on va avoir peur que...
Daniel, sorry to interrupt. Excuse me, Daniel. May I ask that you wrap up in the next 30 seconds, please? Thank you.
OK. Je disais, je suis en train de finir, hein. Je disais que de plus en plus de gens ont le courage d'aller porter plainte, de dénoncer les cas de violation de leurs droits. Plusieurs communautés sont organisées aussi en collectif et ces communautés portent les plaidoyers. Des cas de violation sont suivis au niveau de la justice par les collectifs. Des institutions de droits de l'homme s'engagent de plus en plus dans le suivi des différents cas qui sont en justice. Les principales, maintenant, on a demandé les principales qualités qui selon nous, rendent ces pratiques. Cette pratique, c'est un dispositif qui favorise la prise de conscience et la responsabilisation des communautés victimes ou potentielles victimes des évictions forcées. C'est aussi un dispositif qui participe, n'est-ce pas, à la formation des leaders et des militants des droits de l'homme qu'on pourrait mobiliser dans tous les différents cas. Actuellement, on a un nombre important de cas et nous avons mis en place une fédération des collectifs qui sont présents dans différentes régions et villes du Cameroun pour pouvoir être prêts à se mobiliser pour défendre les cas selon la localité. Donc voilà, en quelques mots, présenter le tribunal populaire des évictions, qui est l'élément, je disais tantôt, des balcons de droit que nous avons installés dans différents quartiers de nos villes et régions du Cameroun. Merci.
Daniel, merci beaucoup. Great to hear about those various details. I will hand over to our discussant, Nancy Odendaal, who is an urban planner and an academic at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She is also the current chair of the Association of African Planning Schools. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, and thank you to both speakers. That was truly very informative, and I've learned a lot from it. So I have 4 minutes to respond. I mean, something that strikes me about both cases is a number of things. I mean, the one thing that strikes me is how both cases speak to a particular system, a particular governance system within which people are essentially capacitated to work within and to work with. I mean, so what we're hearing in the South African case is how participants in these processes are trained to understand their governance context, are trained to understand their rights. And in the Cameroon context, how participants are essentially alerted to the fact that this legal mechanism is available to them, the popular tribunal of evictions, that this legal mechanism is available to them that they can use to their advantage. I mean, something that strikes me in both examples or both cases is the one is that in both examples, what's being done is a kind of, there are legacies that need to be addressed. And the apartheid legacy in South Africa, there's the kind of colonial legacy, there's the apartheid legacy and the impact that that has on neighborhoods and on marginalized communities. In Cameroon, there's the kind of legacy of evictions of those on the margins that are kind of in less formal circumstances. And how does one move from those legacies and building new legacies and building new ways of practices, new practices that could kind of take us into kind of new ways of doing things. And in the South Africa, in the Cape Town case, what we're seeing is that the tools, that there's a kind of active, there's an active process of issue-based organizing, of starting with the self, starting with knowing the neighborhood, knowing the self, and building the tools through knowing your organization, knowing your community, to kind of build, kind of work towards kind of more sustainable ways of voicing dissension, and essentially building these new legacies and building agency. I was very, very taken with the term building agency. I think that's a hugely positive term, and I think that speaks to building new legacies. I mean, what strikes me, the resources there that are sort of being focused upon, what kind of resources are available to people to kind of forge a new pathway, is around knowledge and data. It's around knowing your city, knowing your organization, knowing your neighborhood, owning your data, owning the information that you have around how many people live in your community, how many people are in trouble, etc. So it's about knowing your organization, knowing your community, and then kind of articulating these issues and learning the language and understanding the planning process, which I know enough of in South Africa to know that it's quite intricate and quite confusing. So it's that kind of knowledge is power dynamic, which speaks to the other case as well. I mean, what we have is a process whereby victims of evictions are educated on their rights, they're educated on the processes available to them to voice their dissensions, and they then get capacitated to move through a kind of process of collective action whereby a case gets built. But again, in building that case, there's a process of building knowledge, there's a process of documentation, which again is owned by those who kind of voicing their dissent. And then, of course, the recommendations that come out of the popular tribunal then sort of enforces a kind of process of collective action, which to me, again, I would say is around, then again, building new legacies. So that's kind of, if I had to kind of draw through parallels with both examples, I mean, I would say it's around those three sets of issues, the one around sort of know your city, know your neighborhood, building knowledge, owning your data, understanding process, understanding institutions. And then the second point that comes to is people are working within their systems rather than trying to kind of overturn their systems, they're working within that. And then the third to me is this kind of building of hope, building of new legacies through these processes. I think, what is that, about 2.5, 3 minutes?
Thank you so much, Nancy. I think what I think what we can really see here is the connection between activism or learning practices around activism and social mobilization, a link between the individual and the community and the broader scale. So we'll move on to our next block, keeping in mind the connection between them. A reminder that we are looking now at learning practices around social mobilization. How do we scale? What do collective processes look like? I am pleased to introduce our next speaker to you. And we will actually be watching a pre-recording due to internet difficulties. We will be hearing from Yera Conte, who is the national chairperson of the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor in Freetown in Sierra Leone. and Joseph McCarthy, who is the Executive Director of the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center in Freetown, known as SLURC. And they will be speaking to us about the learning practices of moving from federation rituals to transforming Freetown on a city scale. We will move to playing the video now, so either over to Julia or to Dave.
We have with what we normally do is to combine the technical understanding which we have with various other forms of action. For instance, it is workshop is a critical part of it, whereby we bring the community people to engage them, have a shared understanding of the city, but also in terms of their communities, the kinds of future they want, their aspirations, as the case may be. But it's also about involving them in different kinds of training, especially those particular skills gaps that we think are missing. But also it's about including them in the kinds of research that we do. We consider that they are a critical part of improvement within their places. And if their places has to be mobilized, it has to be given the kind of skills that is required. It's about pushing them into action. We have to work together to do collective research to be able to actually understand what kinds of issues are there and that matters to them and needs to be acted upon.
The capacity on the skills we have for training and listening on the workshops, it has to reflect on when we are doing the chats. So we understand the health system in our communities, we understand the employment system in our community, the housing system, everything we understand. So that one can be built and take back to community people, because not everybody will go to the training, neither the workshop. But the few that we go as leaders, when we go back, we strategize that particular knowledge we have from that particular training and workshop on the chat and explain to those who can understand exactly how it works. So gradually, that's how we do it. But how this can be transformed into that one. So we also do it in community, mobilizing community, organizing communities into savings groups, because the savings groups is very important. There we pass on our messages. As long as you belong to a savings groups, when we have meetings, we have messages to disseminate. We disseminate those messages into those savings groups. So everybody wants to be part of that savings group because their money is there and they want to hear new things about what is happening within the savings. Then they'll be listening. This is the outcome of what we did, and this is how we do it. So they can understand and get the clear knowledge. So it brings change in development in that particular form. But of course, we have the knowledge in working with workshops, going trainings in developing our skills, joint research to understand how the community and how things are working. And then we mobilize ourselves in passing this information so people can understand exactly what is happening.
For us to have a transformed change, there is need to mobilize public action to also engineer the process of collective understanding of what really matters to the different communities and how this relates to the citywide agenda. So basically, there is the community level platform where issues at that particular level are being discussed among the residents themselves. What is it that is missing? What is it that matters to them? What are their aspirations? How are these met? And what are some of the gaps? I'll make reference to one of the research we did on the Community Action Area Plan. And this particular research was in response to the chaotic nature of the informal settlements within Freetown. It's not the case that they don't want to have an organized kind of system, but the fact remains that most of them are not even aware in terms of the process that will lead to this, but also in terms of the capacity that they require and how to even advocate for change within these particular spaces. So we work together to more or less have a discussion in terms of if there was to be improvement, especially to deal with issues of eviction, to deal with issues of fire accidents, to deal with issues of accessibility. What kind of transformation do we need And so we had to discuss for over 9 months, the research period, over 9 months, allowed us to discuss with people from the community level to the neighborhood level to the city level and all those particular kinds of space, building, dreaming, diagnosis, and different forms of processes using the ASF UK methodology. And so we are able to get particular principles in terms of how to bring about change within these communities.
So after the CAP, just after the CAP, we have the disaster management committee that have a lot of flooding within Douazan. So CIS was having a project in that particular community with fed up. How can they come with this? But the project they come with is far different from what we are expecting because we have our priority in the communities and how we want to do this particular thing. So at the end of the day, we try to change the face of the project that CIS gives to us. That yes, we want to receive your funding, we want to do this particular, but we already have a system that's already been built on how we plan our community, how we want to plan to be sustainable. So can you please allow us to explain on how we have this plan and see the direction we are going so you can put these resources in a particular one? And then we explain. It was so amazing for them to understand that this kind of planning is within communities. So because we have the system and we have the training on the CAP, it has changed the face of the projects that are coming in.
I think it's so much about recognition of the different forms of knowledge and abilities to learn, but in terms of respecting that there is that tacit knowledge within the communities for the very fact that they live in these particular spaces, they understand those particular spaces, and see how collectively those particular forms of knowledge, the technical and the tacit, can be brought to bear on the problems, the challenges that needs to be addressed.
Ownership of our own development. If at all we don't participate in any of this particular thing that we are doing, then definitely we are not even recognized. So we have to participate. That shows recognition. And we have to collaborate with other institutions that will overlap or overlay on all the activities we've been doing. We've been doing things like this, but if we are not collaborating, we are not participating, like workshops, we are not participating in meetings, we are not participating in the development of the city, because we are living in an informal settlement, you can start, but you cannot end. Because we have our own role to play, we have our own knowledge to share to you that will end that particular construction or whatever plan.
Well, thank you for that. Joseph and Yera are with us also in this workshop, so please feel free to contact them directly over the chat. Very interesting connections there between skills, mobilization, action, and then also learning practices around savings groups, community action plans. So thank you for that. We will next move to a reflection and a presentation on co-producing urban infrastructure in Kangemi by Dr. Steve Uma Akot, who is the Executive Director of Pamoja Trust and a faculty member at the Department of Applied Economics at Kenyatta University, as well as Diana Wachira, who is an urban planner at Pamoja Trust and works in precedence setting and problem-solving methodologies and models for inclusive and sustainable cities. Over to you, Diana and Steve.
Thank you very much, and glad to have been invited here. Great company. Just to say, I'm no longer the executive director. I am now retired, and I serve in the board, however, of Pamoja Trust. Because of time, I will go straight to the presentation. You are rolling it from your side, please.
Yes, we are. You can go ahead.
Okay, and my colleague Diana has allowed me to do the presentation on behalf of all of us. And if you can go to the next slide, I'll appreciate. So Pamoja Trust is a non-governmental organization which works with social movements in Nairobi, and one of the movements it works with is Muungano na Vijiji, but it also works with various formations, community-based organizations, market traders, street vendors, and so on. So it's Muungano is sort of sometimes the emblem, but it constitutes more than one institution. Now we're about 2 decades old. Let's go on. So the pedagogical approach that Pamoja Trust has developed is one that is referred to as no organized claim. For those of you who are not familiar with Nairobi, Nairobi is the capital city of Kenya with an old history, basically organized around the railway infrastructure. And so infrastructure remains a very important spine for development, planning, and settlement, And the idea is because of a general unwritten policy that tends to undermine poor settled areas at the expense of high income areas. So a lot of poor income people tend to produce places around the infrastructure spine. So initially it was mainly around the railway, but now it's also really around the major roads. So for that reason, with the current big investment in infrastructure in Africa, and Kenya is not left out, there's been huge spikes of evictions. And so using this model that is built on the old work of Pamoja in liaison with HIC and other partners, we've been able to develop a way of engagement that enables people to engage with the infrastructure and infrastructure to engage with the people and get a different result. Next slide. So in terms of knowing, so this is how it all works. So knowing has got observing, listening, historicizing, and you had that a lot coming out from the other presentations as well. Locating, because a road in Nairobi is different from a road in Mombasa in terms of its meaning and the meaning that it is given. And then organizing, organized by doing what? By problematizing. So the road is not a natural occurrence. The road is not a gift from government. The road is a component of governance. Groundworking, so people at their own level being able to design how to relate with the infrastructure and then plan, mobilize, and then claiming is in terms of converging the various resources for claim making, leveraging in terms of numbers, in terms of law, in terms of moral, political, and sometimes even associational claim to power, and then advocate, and then come back and reflect. So that's the model, no organized claim. So let's see an example of what's happening, which I think is useful in this conversation about emancipatory approach. So let's go to the next slide. So Pamoja then has built what it is doing in Kangemi in particular based on the work that is done over the years. We did an enumeration exercise. We did that with the Mazingira Institute, and we used a tool that we've worked on together. Our exercise in Kangemi in particular focused a lot on the role of women traders. And after that, we organized the data and have used the data now to mobilize and to organize people to do claim making. And you'll see a little bit how that has gone in the next slide. So often the road is seen as a different dead non-human actor. But the work that we've done in Kangemi shows that the road should not be treated as a dead non-human actor. Rather, what we know now, go to the next slide, is that you have to, yes, yeah, is that you have to look at how the road makes people and people make the road in terms of some, around the road, there's a market that has been organized, and even when people have been pushed away, they have made sure that they don't move away from the road. Rather, they have created a way that the road meanders and the road accepts overpasses that would allow them to also do their work. And that's possible because of, next slide, because of the thought that rather than just sort of past knowledge about mapping the place or seeing it as a modern thing, is asking the question, what new value does this give us? And Kenya has a very robust constitution, and chapter 4 of our constitution is on human rights, and article 10 is on values. So one of the questions that people ask is not just the mobility and movement, but how about values like participation, like dignity, like sustainability, like equity, like equality. Next slide. So then ultimately, what you see is that the road is asked to be a space through which these values are produced. This is what you're saying is a debate between multiple rationalities, the rationality of building the modern road to make Nairobi competitive and so on, and this other rationality, which is really anchored in the Constitution of Kenya and other international instruments. Next slide. So ultimately, next slide. Ultimately, that becomes the spirit to organize. And in organizing, this is one of the key things that I think we've done also around with HIC. Initially, the idea was, you do enumeration and then you organize, and then the next discussion is, can we get compensation because we are being relocated? But now, this question of a different rationality and the fact that the road is seen as not a dead thing, but as an active thing, has brought conversation about restoration, reparation, reinstitution, satisfaction, and non-repetition. And that has meant that the ultimate outcome is not people moving away from the areas where they were getting better income, they had better connections, they had better, which were livable, but having a way that will enable them to coexist with the road. And we are very happy in Kangemi, for example, there has been no eviction up to now. It's been a negotiation between the road and the people to make sure that we talk more about non-repetition of displacement, reinstitution, reparations, and restoration, rather than the old conversation of compensate and move away. And that we think is very important in terms of making sure that those in the margins are not moved to further margins when the places they live in have mega investment and infrastructure intervention. Next slide. So basically that's the story of how an initial work that was done essentially as a way of recognizing by doing enumerations has now shifted to being a way of affirming the permanency of the urban dwellers in the margins, popularly known as urban poor, but by making sure that with the mega infrastructure, that is now a big thing in not only in Kenya, but many also South African countries, the road becomes a social actor. And people organize the road, and the road organizes the people, and the two see how to coexist without diminishing opportunities for the urban poor. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steve Akwat. Fascinating. I think we are really hearing some incredible approaches to learning and learning practices here, the connection between no organized claim and that the way we see and think about seeing changes how we act. I imagine that you have lots of thoughts that are arising as well. So if you're a participant in this workshop, please feel free to post your thoughts, questions, comments in the chat. We'd love to engage with them. The last learning practice we'll look at in this section will be presented to us by Hilary Shu. He is the national coordinator of the Zimbabwe People's Land Rights Movement and a land rights activist. And we'll be speaking about a fascinating spread of the cooperative system of urban social production of housing and amenities, and particularly how learning grew between different urban centers in Zim in relation to housing. So over to you, Hilary.
Okay, thank you so much, Yolanda. And happy Africa Day to everyone. Good day. Hilary Jo, and I'm the national coordinator for the Zimbabwe People's Land Rights Movement. Basically, we were founded on the basis of trying to promote and protect land rights for all Zimbabweans in general. So going just into my presentation of the cooperative system of social production of housing, particularly in urban areas, there's been, just going back to the history, you all know about the Zimbabwe, the land reform program in Zimbabwe. It had quite a lot of ripple effects throughout the various sectors of the economy of our society, and also maybe about, also it changed and displaced quite a lot of other people during the course of that. So when basically these, when the first land reform started in the late 2000s, late 90s, it caused a lot of a huge displacement of people from who were formerly farm workers. These people who were formerly farm workers and had for decades been accommodated on farms. There were hundreds of thousands of families like that who were displaced into urban centers. But already all these urban towns were already almost up to their capacities because of the general rural-urban migration, which was already happening from the late 90s, getting into the 2000s. So this saw a huge influx of overwhelming number of people getting into towns. Then going forward, some 5 years down the line from 2000, during this beginning of the land reform, there was what was known globally as Operation Murambachina in Zimbabwe. That was in 2005. This in its own had a very, very detrimental, and I'm just trying to find maybe other ways to explain how it affected a lot of people, because hundreds of thousands also were displaced from the urban areas into unknown destinations. So this in its own created a vacuum of whereby people wanted, there was a very high demand for housing, particularly in urban areas. And also the government of the day, as you would know by then, our economy was not stable up to today. The collapse of most of the systems, the urban councils, the collapse of both even the central government. So this may left a gap, a huge gap in terms of the need to housing, both in completed housing and also the infrastructure which goes with that. So this in its own led to the first invasions of mostly peri-urban areas in the country. Most of them were farms. Those who were displaced by Murambachina, or those who were displaced from who were former farm workers, were also started to invade peri-urban farms, seeking to get accommodation, seeking to get a piece of land where they could build their temporary shelters, while at least maybe they are on the government waiting list or seeking alternative accommodation. So from these first invasions, then that is when the cooperative system then came up. People just began to come up in groups and try to engage both local and central government in trying to get permission to maybe change the use of the land use patterns on that piece of land they were occupying. And usually these groups will be between 100 and at times 1,000 people or families, who then try to engage using their local politicians that are councillors and the national politicians and MPs and the ministers and the other politicians who are in the political or ruling or opposition political parties, to get an agreement to get a lease maybe, or an agreement to use that land, or also develop it themselves. So gradually with time, this system was perfected, which came up, then people could basically cut out what is basically the middleman, which is either the municipal council or private developers. So these groups of cooperatives would access land directly from central government, and then they would build their own houses, they would build their own amenities, and also service their own land, which they usually would have acquired through those negotiations with the politicians. And at times it wouldn't go well, because they would be like what has been now termed as land barons, would use their political connections to acquire that land from the government and then sell over to those cooperatives. So basically, I think that is just a brief history of the cooperative system of social production of housing. Though it has come with quite a lot of other challenges, like I think on the pictures, the first pictures are of that of Korobro. They are currently facing eviction because of ownership wrangles between the cooperative, some middlemen who are known as land barons, and also the city of Harare. And also on the last pictures there, you would find that those are in the first pictures. The small houses there, they are just the temporary structures they would have built while it's waiting to get permission to build better houses like the one which you see in the last picture. And unfortunately, in the last picture, as you can see, there's a bulldozer which is actually destroying this house. This is mainly because of, it's a very nice house. If you look at it, this person has actually managed to build his very own decent housing using his own funds without even any subsidies or loans or mortgages from commercial or private developers. So you would find that what would happen usually in some of these cases, the ownership of that piece of land will be in dispute, because there will be maybe quite a number of middlemen who are involved in that land being in the acquisition of that land from central government to eventually these cooperatives. And then from these learning lessons, we have then tried to come up with focus group discussion for focus groups which engage with these owners of these cooperatives on how, and educate them on how best to, on the stages, basically we can say, of acquiring land from maybe from the state or maybe from the city councils. In the smaller cities, it is quite easier. In the smaller towns, it is quite easier for them to engage the local government so that they can acquire this land, or the central government. But in larger cities, there's a lot of corruption, also a lot of confusion. So there are some groups, focus group discussions, which we have with cooperative members on how best they can engage or the legal steps of acquiring this land, and how best they can be able to, they can get title or leases or whatever agreements they can have in a legal manner, so that eventually they do not have situations where they have invested and then they have their houses destroyed.
Thank you. May I ask you to conclude?
Okay, I think I was just on just finishing up now. So I think basically that is what I would want to share, the cooperative system of whereby people would cut out the middlemen, whereby they would direct their otherwise monthly rentals to the development of their own properties. So basically and briefly, I think that is the cooperative system in Zimbabwe.
Hilary, thank you so much. Fascinating once again how a practice emerged in response to a very practical political situation actually, and land invasions and then actually growing crops in order to challenge these and to find alternative ways of constructing housing, and then sharing about these in various focus group discussions. Lawrence Apio, who is Pioneer Community Organizer in Kenya and the president of a network of organizations of inhabitants in Africa, is our discussant for this section, and I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you. Wow, how wonderful to listening from the first block and the second block, listening to Dr. Steve and all the rest. And one thing that comes in, which is cutting across in all, is people at the center, and people coming together because they have identified issues, that they have identified the injustices, and all the works around them lead to the development of a community organization that with the structures that now engages widely with different stakeholders. I see from all the presentations how then the communities of people start using different methods, for example, savings, operations, and planning to influence the duty bearers, those who make policies, those who implement government programs. Unlike in the past where people develop, the government develops programs in their offices, does planning in their offices, and the top-down approach coming to implement. Here is a situation where people are able to generate their informal plans and influence the making of formal plans. I have an experience in Kenya where even could not give loans to those who live in the informal settlements, informal markets. But as soon as they started getting organized, doing their own savings, giving out their loans, then there were few who are customers in the formal banking sector. And so the banks themselves started sending their agents to these people in their residential areas to ask them to open up accounts in their formal banks and seek loans. And even the loan interest got reduced. So the other thing that we see is with people developing their informations through enumerations, building their own data, they are able then to be listened to. They are able to negotiate, sit with those in authority to negotiate for resources, for improvement in their settlements, for services in their settlements. And they use this to struggle to remake their communities, to reshape their communities. And this is where the ownership emerges. And through these processes, we see there is much contributions towards a responsive, accountable policies, legislations that respect the people's needs, that take into consideration the people's needs. This is a new, I would call it a new philosophy, where people become the drivers of their own processes. People become the owners of their own products. And so this is continuously influencing the duty bearers and changing the whole governance paradigm so that people are participating in their governance processes. So I would end by saying that so much has been done, but there is much to be done. And through these processes, then we are able to make collective contributions to the change, to bring change in our own areas and environment. Thank you.
Lawrence, thank you very much. So what does it look like then when learning practices specifically have advocacy and the end impact in sight? This is what we have asked our speakers in the last block to share with us. And it's a pleasure to introduce to you Amita Tulifo, who is a program officer at the International Budget Partnership in Senegal. Her work includes conducting budget advocacy for the access of vulnerable groups, such as people with disabilities, women's movements, and communities in informal settlements to improve social services. She will be speaking to us about inclusive cities and budget equity. Aminata, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. And congrats to all the speakers for their really fascinating presentations. It's really my pleasure to share with you the work that we do here at IBP Senegal. So working in informal settlements and trying to increase residents' access to social services. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief overview of the situation of vulnerable groups in informal settlements in Senegal. Thank you. So vulnerable groups living in informal settlements in Senegal do not have access to adequate sanitation and basic social services. So they are not only economically vulnerable because they don't have access to social services and they're mostly poor households, but they also have settled in non-edificandi areas which have grown quickly and also been neglected by urban policies. And also the lack of consideration of the vulnerability criterion as well as the absence of sanitation policy have led to poor targeting in the construction of public sanitation facilities and also negatively impacted service delivery for vulnerable households. Also, speaking of housing policies, they've neglected to take into consideration informal settlement residents who are often excluded from public programs that require bank guarantees as a criterion for enrollment, because most of these residents are workers of the informal economy, so they're de facto excluded from these programs that require bank guarantees. So what we do at IBP Senegal in informal settlements, we work with Urbacent FSH, who we can call urban champions for improved services. So in brief, Urbacent FSH, we provide technical and financial support to them. And they're an organization that brings together urban professionals, but also the Senegalese Federation of Inhabitants, which consists of more than 12,000 women in informal settlements. So we work with them on a program that's called the Sanitation and Social Services Program, which aims at reinforcing their access to sanitation and improved social services, but mainly housing and community infrastructure. And so two of the main advocacy entry points are the government's 10 cities program for sanitation, which basically consists of subsidies for social connections to have access to individuals and collective sanitation, but also the government's flagship housing program, which consists of having more than 100,000 social housing programs for informal settlement residents. And with the support of IBP, Urbacent FSH has been able to build alliances with local elected officials, parliamentarians, civil society organizations, and community-based organizations, as well as the media. So these people really play a critical role in strengthening our advocacy strategy, but also facilitating the access of informal settlement residents to local and central level decision-making spaces. Next. Thank you. So our strategy at IBP also focuses on deconstructing the norms around service delivery and inclusion. So trying to link the lived experiences of informal settlement residents to budget exclusion. And the idea behind that is trying to provide marginalized groups the opportunity to tell their story and try to understand the ways to which service delivery gaps translate into a negative human experience and ultimately create a sense of exclusion. So we really are trying to promote new ways of thinking about service delivery that is very much rights-based and participatory, but also trying to improve their understanding of budget inclusion and equity. So also trying to improve the group's self-esteem and awareness of their rights, as we've realized this is a prerequisite towards more engagement with local elected officials, but also national level decision makers. But finally, also trying to apply an intersectional approach to advocacy, so taking into consideration gender, disability, geography, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. So at IBP, our work also focuses on strengthening the group's what we call the collective agency. So first, like I said before, building their confidence to engage with public decision makers and service providers, but also strengthening collective action at the local level. So we do a lot of trainings and workshops on sanitation, urban planning, land management, and also financial management for our women's groups of the National Federation of Senegalese Inhabitants, but also really focusing on improving budget literacy. So in order to reinforce participation, we do a lot of capacity building in budget analysis and advocacy. So trying to develop the group's capacity to first understand the budget calendar and the processes, and also being able to identify budget advocacy opportunities and engaging with relevant authorities on budget allocation issues. So trying to understand the linkages between budget exclusion and service delivery, but also trying to understand how having more inclusive budgets can ultimately create a better sense of ownership of programs, but also participation in governance. But also facilitating peer learning. So we have a lot of, in our FSH groups, municipal workers. So these women share their experiences with their peers and the lessons learned from their experiences. And we basically try to promote this peer learning where people who are engaged at the municipal level can also share their experience and make others more involved at the local and national level. Next slide, please. So we also do a lot of data collection and evidence building because we realize that the evidence is the main incentive for local elected officials to react to our advocacy campaigns. So IBP generates a lot of citizen feedback on how communities experience service delivery to identify the root causes of the shortcomings reported. We also do a lot of collection of socioeconomic data concerning various municipalities in the settlements where we intervene. So community mapping, neighborhood boundary delimitation through drones, and a lot of innovative technology. And we've seen that this data has really been a key incentive that facilitated the interactions with local elected officials and public decision makers. But also we do a lot of assessments. So for instance, during COVID, we did a rapid assessment on the impact of COVID on vulnerable households in informal settlements, which really contributed to improving COVID relief delivery as municipalities use the collected data to ensure an equitable targeting and distribution of COVID assistance. So trying to bring something new to the table, which can serve as an incentive, and also doing field visits where we take stock of service delivery shortcomings and identify budget bottlenecks, and then do social accountability forum with local elected officials, parliamentarians, and different sets of actors that can bring the results that we desire. Next slide, please.
Aminata, may I ask you to conclude in the next 30 seconds, please?
Okay, so engaging with decision makers, we've been collaborating with a lot of national level and local level decision makers. So doing multi-stakeholder dialogues, constantly engaging with local elected officials, but also building coalition with civil society organizations. Next slide, please. Maybe the lessons learned slide, please. So basically, we've really been able to make sure that informal settlement residents got a seat at the table, decision-making table. And what we've learned from all these processes is that capacity building is central to strengthening collective action. So developing an understanding of budget processes and also trying to navigate the fiscal ecosystem to be able to identify advocacy opportunities, doing a lot of evidence building so that we can engage with public decision makers meaningfully, and especially in the context of competing priorities and limited state resources, but also valuing the knowledge and lived experiences of communities. So no one size fits all top-down approach, which really tend to disturb the social organization of communities, but also not reinventing the wheel. So trying to adopt organic methods that put communities at the center of processes and reinforce their ability to drive change. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aminata. Fascinating there to hear about the learning practices around budget advocacy, peer learning with municipal workers, as well as community members. Next, I would like to introduce to you Diana D. Smith, who is a member of HIC, the Habitat International Coalition, since its transformation in 1986, and leader of the Women and Shelter Network from 1988 to 1995. Diana also helped to found the Mazingira Institute based in Kenya, which is a 43-year-old African activist organization integrating knowledge and practice. Diana will be speaking about urban food and agriculture, knowledge, skills, and agency for a subaltern community. Diana, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and Devinder is also around. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, this presentation, as you said, deals with urban food, and the subaltern community means excluded and not listened to communities. Next slide. Why and how the learning practice emerged. Next slide. As you said, Mazingira Institute was set up 43 years ago. It's an activist institution that integrates knowledge and practice, which is what HIC does. Now, I wanted to tell you it's also a research organization. So research comes into a lot of the work. And the first study was of the informal sector public transport. So that was in 1978 till 80. And it did, in fact, bring about change to the law in 1984. I won't go into details. Next slide. The next piece of research, which was major, was a national survey which found that 1/3 of urban dwellers produce food in town, including livestock keeping. However, nobody wanted to do anything about it. Next slide, please. Urban farming was seen as dirty and dangerous. Next slide, please. Eventually, Mazingira Institute, in an attempt to address this, set up the Nairobi Forum on Urban Food and Agriculture. Next slide. This is that forum. Next. Anyone who was interested could come, and in fact did come, government, researchers, and farmers, but they all wanted different things. Next slide. These are some of the participants. Next slide. Farmers just wanted the harassment of food production to stop. They also wanted training. Extension workers who were in central government at that time wanted to find out where the farmers were. They didn't know. And then Mazingira Institute started hosting farmers training and got government and researchers to make an input to that training, along with leading the training themselves. The changes that were generated, the second question, next. Farmers felt more respected. Next. These are just pictures to show you some of the gatherings and the farmers. Farmers learned more. That was a major achievement. Next slide. This is women farmers and women. Can you go back one? Women were central to all of this, and there was a women's part of the forum. So here they're learning about livestock. Next slide. Also learning about seeds and collaborative seed production. Next slide, please. Local officials learned more. Next slide, please. So there were many gatherings in different places and venues with farmers and local officials. Next slide, please. These are some of the meetings that were held where you can see the farmers looking more assertive and working with local officials. Everyone learned more about the urban food system. Next slide, please. What is an urban food system? It's very, very complicated, and a lot of things have taken place since, where people are now all talking about urban food systems. However, in this case, you can see that researchers finally met producers. Next. You can see here some of the buildings housing livestock and how inputs and outputs are moved around the urban food system. Next slide. Here you can see, go back, yes, thank you. Thank you for following my presentation. Here you can see livestock production and tending. You can also see how food for the animals is provided, and this is a lot of small businesses, this one operating by bicycle, bringing feed to cows. The inputs, by the way, come from roadsides in urban areas, and they're picked by bicycle and brought to the animals. Then in the left-hand side, you can see some of the efforts to find customers for milk. And that is a very active, perhaps one of the most active food industries in Kenya is dairy. Next slide, please. A lot of it is urban. Now here again, we see women in the food chain. This is the vegetable supply chain, and this is called a mama mboga, woman vegetable seller. Next. Next. Land is obviously essential. Next. There were global connections, and in terms of pedagogy, we got to the level of confidence where farmers were giving talks in universities, sometimes in the United States, sometimes in Kenya. And a waste picker, who is still associated with our network, became a consultant and trainer, doing very well. Thank you. Next. These are some of the meetings. Next. This is an exchange with Sierra Leone. Next. This is another exchange and the demonstration of vegetable production next. Changes did come about in policy. It took 2 decades. Nairobi now has one of the best urban food and agriculture sectors in the world, and there was an ICLEI food system dialogue last week. Nairobi has 250 staff in food systems management in the city. Next. These are some of the events with policymakers. Next. Decentralization, including across the city, different offices and outreach. Next.
May I ask you to conclude in 30 seconds?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will. The key qualities that made this learning emancipatory. Next. The key was the putting up of the tent, a co-learning space, the physical one. The other was seeding space. You have to know as an NGO when your work is done. You don't run a city. Next. This is one of the meetings in the tent. Next. That is the last slide, and thank you very much.
Wonderful, Diana, thank you. Very inspiring, the Nairobi Forum on Urban Food and Agriculture, and how bringing together people with very different interests in a co-learning space can bring about such transformation and impact over time. So thank you for that. Lastly, we'll be hearing about another forum, and this will be the Land Forum in the Middle East, North Africa region of HIC, the Habitat International Coalition, which will be presented by my colleague Joseph Sheckler, who is the coordinator of the Global and Middle East North Africa programs of HIC and the Housing and Land Rights Network based in Cairo. Joe, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and happy Africa Day to everyone. I'm speaking to you from Cairo, from North Africa, and it's always good to remind ourselves that we are part of Africa. And I'll start with a little anecdote. I think it's still in Banjul, they're still talking about one of our colleagues from Tunisia who went to the NGO forum at the Africa Commission and announced happily that he was so glad to be in Banjul. It was his first opportunity to visit Africa. So it just indicates that sometimes we have to remind each other that we're all one. We're all part of one continent. And I guess I can show my face. I hope my internet holds out. Just stay on that slide for a while. I just want to explain what the Land Forum is. It has always been an open platform for individuals, members of HIC, but having a collective learning exchange within a human rights framework. And this is the value added, in fact, for such an activity. These were people who came together by invitation or self-initiative, and in the context of often other mass events, whether it's a HIC General Assembly or World Social Forum. So we had also collaboration with other networks. You see someone sitting there with a La Via Campesina scarf on his bandana on his neck. We had people from other networks as well. And this was also one of the, spoke to one of the reasons why and how this emerged. Of course, dealing with the question of the relative isolation of the Arab world, but in particular North Africa, from the rest of the continent and also from other networks. This was an opportunity to expose the participants to each other. But the focus of this was really the issues of North Africa and Middle East. And it took place at a period within HIC when Devinder Lamba was a president. It was the time when we had one of our surges of pedagogy within the coalition. It was in 2008 that the HIC Academy was proposed and agreed upon. It was also when we had a project in West Africa, really training and capacity building on the human right to water. Other things were going on at the same time in parallel, and it was really a key moment in 2009 when we had the first land forum in Middle East North Africa. It was also at a time when HIC had initiated a convergence process within the World Social Forum that is bringing together the urban, the rural, and the indigenous groups who are otherwise quite estranged from each other. So in learning in the Land Forum, we also learned about these concepts and about peoples who were not really the subject of exposure typically to our partners in North Africa. It also sought to address the question of address the lack of social movements in the same form that exist in classic reference to those in Latin America and elsewhere, not because there are not the same impulses or that they're not the same ingredients for social movements. We find that in social production, like we heard from Hillary, these impulses are very much the same in the region, but they're often not connected. They're punctual, they're disconnected from each other. And one of the other purposes we wanted to achieve was having a regional character, that is, having a regional diagnosis of the land issues in our region. Of course, being inspired by Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed, pedagogy for freedom, but also Rosa Luxemburg, whose legacy was so much about international education for the rank and file. So these approaches were all combined, but within a human rights framework in the Land Forum. The tactics we used sometimes were often surprise, contradictions, but as always, to get people to change their minds about an issue. But one of them was particularly useful, and that's the comparative analysis. Finding that there was common ground among the different fragments within the region, and from the Mashriq to the Maghreb. One of the kind of pivotal comparative analysis points was occupation, conflict and occupation, where, of course, Palestine under colonization and Western Sahara under occupation and colonization by Morocco were 2 points of mutual recognition by partners and a real learning process for everyone. And because we were using human rights, it was not a human rights education approach, but a professional training approach that is addressing the human rights, the practicality of human rights in the functions that people are actually doing in their regular work. So what changes were achieved? Well, we had a regional diagnosis. You can go to the next slide now. That was especially useful in pointing out the regional character, and when it comes to conflict and reparations, which Dr. Steve spoke about, the issues really emerged where we had common ground across the whole region. Land as a special value, cultural value, essential to self-determination, essential to health, essential to the right to food, of course, housing, etc. Dealing with tenure and tenure rights as a spectrum, as a continuum, not a progression, but a continuum. Gender, of course, introducing the concept of the right to the city and its composite parts. Corruption, which is a common issue, especially in the land sector. Conflict, as I mentioned, globalization, and of course, what was happening at the same time after 2009, we had the Arab uprisings in 2011 and 12. So land and revolution became a very important issue, as did land in constitutions and policy reform, as well as transitional justice. So the principal objective of HLRN, the Housing and Land Rights Network, is to build capacity of civil society so that they can be effective in international forums and, of course, speaking with policymakers in any case. And so what we had in this process of change were very important events. The negotiations for the tenure guidelines of FAO that were adopted in 2012 and 2015, after 3 years of negotiation, the framework for action for food security and nutrition in protracted crises, that is the policy of the Committee on World Food Security. Right now, we have a land issue emerging in the formation and negotiation of a general comment before the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And also among the outcomes were our partners in the Land Forum were advocates before the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and before the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva within the Human Rights Council, specific for Egypt, Yemen, and Sudan. So, okay, and I'll just conclude. If you can show the next slides, just on the question of, did you already show the map? Yeah, the next one after that, this map showed the countries that have displaced persons because of conflict. And what we did for the first time, no UN agency had ever attempted to really show the full picture, the diagnosis of those persons who are eligible for reparations for displacement in the region. So well over 33 million of them still are eligible for reparations. And then now the last slide is really, okay, the one before that is, oh, I'm sorry, the Land Forum. I mean, the Land Times is the ongoing spirit of the Land Forums. That's a regular periodical that achieves and seeks to achieve at least the same objectives as of the Land Forum on a continuous basis. So building capacity for advocacy on these issues that have been so much the subject of isolation geographically and also within the human rights community. So we're building that capacity on a regular basis. So I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yolande, you're mute.
You're on mute. I am muted. Sorry about that. So thank you, Joseph, for that. I will hand over to Professor Wilbert Kombe just for some closing reflections. He's Professor of Urban Land Management and Director of the Institute of Human Settlement Studies at RD University in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Professor Kombe, you've got 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Sorry, it has been a learning process to me. Actually, it has been a very inspiring moment for me to listen to all the presentation from the first to this one. One of the issues which I find quite interesting across the context and with the varying situations from regions, from Zimbabwe to Kenya to North Africa, I see several issues which are cross-cutting despite the differences. One is that there's a very strong element of co-learning, which is cutting across the processes, and co-learning in a context where there are power differences between the traditional thinking of who is to teach, from whom we have to learn, and those who are learning from us. And this is, I'm talking about the elites and the communities. This is cutting across the sections. And I find it quite interesting looking at what has been done by the Mazingira in Nairobi, as well as in North Africa, and the other colleague who presented on the other aspect. The second thing which I found quite interesting, which is important, is the question of the sharing experiences. Trying to learn from each other and knowing that knowledge is not held by our own cases. There are many cases which have detected knowledge and from which we can learn and from which community can see from the real life experience. This is something which is very important. We often forget in our learning processes that practical issues of learning include real life case studies, which has been discussed extensively in the literature of case studies. And it's therefore very important. And I realize it has been cutting across. And this goes together with the valuing education, valuing knowledge which is held by other people, which is not necessarily within our discipline, which is not necessarily peers in terms of our background and whatnot. And this is very critical. The other thing which I realized and which was very critical is the moments of learning, the periods when learning becomes very critical and how it is organized. When I look at the Mazingira issue, it was quite clear that there was already a difference between the elites, between the bureaucrats and the communities. And the intervention which Mazingira designed, which brought them together, was quite critical. The time when there is already a tension, there is already misunderstanding, there's already this appreciation of each other's knowledge. The same applies to the North African experience, North African experiences of the land issues, which is also a situation where we do not have the common ground, and therefore we have to find a common ground where learning can be critical, and where tactics for learning have to be critically evaluated. The other thing which I find critical, which I would also want to mention, was the issue of the capacity building, which is very critical across the cases. That we are talking of a situation where often communities have to be enabled to be able to dialogue, to be able to share, to be able to exchange learning processes with peers, with officials, from within their community and without the communities. That was the case in the case of North African situation, and as well as in Mazingira, as well as in the other case of which was presented earlier. I therefore think these are very critical moments, and I think it is food for us, it is food for thought to take interest in these diverse learning platforms and learning contexts, which are very critical. My only question which I have, and which I think was which was not addressing the issues, was the question of strategic platforms which are important for learning. What are the strategic platforms which are strategic for learning and which have to be considered? And finally, my own experience of what we've been doing in some research works, which you know in Ananasi, the question of power. Power is not always easily shared, particularly where communities tend to believe strongly that these are coming from a different level. They are official from the government, they are from the university, they have this and this and this and these skills and competencies. Therefore, even when you create capacity building processes, the legacy, the tendency to think that university colleagues, public officials are better informed and they are more prepared to provide better solutions is always there, and sometimes taken very strongly by community.
Professor
And therefore,
to conclude, please.
Thank you. And therefore, I think this is a challenge which I would like the colleagues to reflect upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been rich. We have heard so much. Time is short. I'm going to hand over directly to Adriana Allen, who will be taking us through the next section.
Hello, happy Africa Day to all, and many thanks, Yolanda, and many thanks to all speakers for these very insightful contributions. You might remember that at the beginning we proposed the idea of crafting together a manifesto. And why is that? Well, because no one can build a future by themselves, and particularly when we talk about futures that involve radical change, difficult changes around oppressive conditions. In that sense, we thought that a manifesto could be a very good way to continue this conversation, not to just leave it, in today's session, but to go over time. And when we look at manifestos, they very often start with a wall, with messages on the wall, and then they evolve into something that is open, collective, and keeps on adding ideas, commitments, pledges. So what we want to do is to expand that conversation and to start crafting together a manifesto. We have a Mentimeter. I don't know if there is a slide there, just to bring more voices. So what we would like to do is to invite you all to go to Menti, www.menti.com, use the code showing there on the slide, 47512926. And very, with a few words, just see if you can address this question. What are in your experience, and also in light of the conversation we are having today, what do you see as the key qualities that make learning practice emancipatory? If you could, I think that there is room for up to 3 qualities, and if you could include 1 quality at a time, we will have that blank wall starting to be populated by everyone's ideas. So we can see the first one, ownership of knowledge. We give a couple of minutes to populate that wall before we reflect together. People center. So these qualities might be connected to what are the key principles that we value. What do we think that emancipatory pedagogies are for or should do, and also how we go about them, how we go about practicing them. So we have many more. They should be disrupted. They should listen in. So we started to have some ideas about the how. They should ensure plurality. They should be contextualized. They should aim to be inclusive, freely available knowledge. So a collective, a legacy, a common knowledge as commons, something that Nancy mentioned before. They should build agency. Just looking to see if there is anything else coming. I think, Julia, you can see the Mentimeter, and if there are still ideas coming. There should be co-leadership, mutual recognition. They should be creative.
So I see also ideas coming up for empathy,
Empathy.
relation to trusted relationships, togetherness, respectfulness, criticality of the learning practices.
So picking up on the idea of using, as advocated by Shou, a human right methodology.
There are a couple in the chat, context sensitive and flexibility and adaptation.
Many thanks for, I mean, we can participatory, I can see, no, coming from Akona. So we can keep on populating that wall. Clearly some are form very much the backbone of our discussion today. The idea that they should be people-centered, they should rely on recognition, they should aim to be inclusive. I know that we have very few minutes before we close, so I'm going just to attempt to read across a bit of the map that is emerging, the wall, the map that we can see on the wall that is being populated. Again, keep on adding ideas as I speak, but also draw a bit on a few things, several things that have been said today by the discussants and the contributors. If I look at this map emerging here, I think that we, on the one hand, on the question of what are emancipatory pedagogies aim for, what are they trying, what are we trying to achieve with emancipatory pedagogies? I think that I see 4 key values or 4 key functions, if you wish, emerging here that many of you referred to. One I would describe as being humanizing. emancipatory pedagogies are meant to humanize the processes through which we engage with realities that are very often oppressive. They're realities that we react, we want to change. And what I mean by humanizing is that they should be populated by love, care, respect for each other, not only for each other, but also for the ways, the many different ways in which we know, we understand the world in which we live, and we act upon it. And I think that this question of love, caring, and respect for each other is a fundamental foundation, if you wish, that many of you highlighted. A second key issue that is coming quite strongly, I think, has to do with the idea of crafting and creating critical consciousness. Freire used to say, well, this is about thinking about emancipatory pedagogies, helping us to realize the power of knowing what we know. And this is very important, yeah? The consciousness of that, the consciousness that we are not empty vessels. We don't need to be filled in by the knowledge of others. We all have knowledge. We all have knowledge that matters. And that critical consciousness is a very important first step into the creating of agency. A third key ingredient that I think that has come very strongly across all the contributions is that of repoliticizing. So in all the cases, we're talking about reacting, challenging oppressive legacies. I think that Nancy put it in that way. We are talking about whether it's about the legacies of evictions, the legacies of apartheid, the legacies of patriarchy, the legacies of food systems being, parts of very important food systems being completely ignored or oppressed and so on. So in challenging these oppressive legacies, we are clearly repoliticizing issues. We are repoliticizing the road, as Steve was helping us to see. No? The road is not something that is just there, but the road is something that makes us and that we make, and that we can make in different ways. So this repoliticization can be very, very material, yeah? Very concrete in many ways. And the fourth key ingredient, I think, has to do with this idea that we mentioned from the beginning of activating agency. So it's not only building agency in the sense that people already have agency, but sometimes that agency is dormant because it's oppressed, precisely because it's oppressed. So the activation of agency is important, extraordinarily important as a what for, as an objective of pedagogy, emancipatory pedagogies. Many of you talk about also the activating community, something collective. So it's not only individual agencies and the power of knowing what I know, but the power of knowing what we know and what we can do. So that collective is extraordinarily important. And we're also talking about activating or building new imaginaries and legacies. So it's not only about, of course, we need to travel back to the past, to question that past, to question that present, but also very much to imagine new and different futures that can guide the action that we take. Now moving, many of the words, the keywords on the wall, on our wall, I think talk about the how we go about that. So in a way, if we were to think about the manifesto, we could think about what do we commit to practice? Yeah, if we believe that emancipatory pedagogies are important, how do we commit to practice them? So there are many, many ideas there, but I will just highlight a few that I see being quite prominent and central to our debate today. The first one, and it's something that Professor Combe finished with, is this idea of really practicing this giving and taking equal voice and recognition between learners and pedagogues. And I think that is very interesting to see that here, I mean, now they talk about teachers and students, and that's, I think, a key principle, a key how that we recognize in emancipatory pedagogies. They almost merging. We are all pedagogues and we're all learners, and that breaking that barrier is an extraordinarily important question in terms of the who practices emancipatory pedagogies. We can all practice these pedagogies. The second question, I think, in terms of the how, has to do with the where, in a way. I think that many of you highlighted as well that emancipatory pedagogies are not practiced necessarily in the classroom or in the university or in higher education institutions, in schools. They are practiced through co-learning spaces that can pop up anywhere. So they go really clearly beyond the classroom. They can be the tent, as Ayana said. Yeah, they can be that tent that we put together. They can be this space. A third key thing that I also see in terms of the house has to do with an emphasis on adopting a problem-posing approach. So it's not necessarily a problem-solving approach, but a problem-posing approach. Rethinking the problem, rethinking together what we see as a problem. What is a problem? A problem for whom? A problem why? We talked already about fostering equal dialogue, but I think that again, this is something to be highlighted. So it's not only about the recognition of each other, but about the dialogue across regions, across cities, across different groups in any city. And Freire used to use a term that is very valuable perhaps here, which he used to talk about engaging in some form of intercultural translation. How do we engage? How do we talk to each other? How do we listen? How do we speak with respect, yeah, for our different accents, for our different interpretations, our different stands with regards to what we value, what we think that is a priority, what needs to be changed, and so on. Last but not least, I think that there is a very important element in terms of the how that has to do with this idea of working in something that is future-oriented. Yeah. So if we are talking about changing legacies that might be oppressive, obviously this idea of visioning something and building different legacies is very, very important. I know there were many more issues. I observed on the chat that there were very interesting questions around, for instance, the question of financing. How do you support many of those things? And I'm sure that, you know, again, where do the resources come from? It's not just money, but the resources to sustain processes of co-learning. And also the monitoring change. I think that right at the beginning, someone asked, but how do we know when is that a pedagogy of the intention of activating agency is really doing that? I think that we saw throughout the many presentations that we have today, precisely how is that we know that we are witnessing something different, that something different is in motion. And of course, there are challenges with regards to keeping that journey, expanding that journey, scaling that, bringing change not only within the community, within communities of learners, but also out there, with the out there very often being also the policy domain and many other domains. I know we're very pressed for time, so I'm going to stop there. And I hope very much that you engage with this invitation to continue building a manifesto on emancipatory pedagogies. And if you are keen to do that, do please add your email address. And what we're going to do next is on the chat. What we're going to do next is, after the session, is we're going to put these many contributions together on an editable paper document, manifesto, and then share that with you for just to expand, refine, and then obviously share with a community that hasn't been here today, but might also want to be part of this wave. Many thanks to all.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for that. We are almost at the end of our workshop. You may be asking, in addition to the manifesto and our crafting, what next? Is this going to be taken forward? You've heard from Diana and from Joseph that HIC has a rich tradition in co-learning spaces and co-learning practices as well. And so we're really wanting to, not just wanting to, but we are taking this forward. We are organizing different co-learning spaces between June and December 2021, and each space will consist of multiple engagements and encounters over 3 months. And you can see the various topics here on the slide. some also planned for 2022. We will be communicating about these soon. If you are interested in engaging more around emancipatory pedagogies, or even becoming part of these co-learning spaces, do post your email in the chat, and we'll keep you updated about the manifesto and its process, as well as these learning spaces. As I said, it's been rich. It's been quite incredible to have such a vast overview and fairly detailed as well. So thank you for your time. We very much appreciate it and look forward to staying in touch with you. So from myself, Adriana, Julia, Gitika, and the entire NODE team and Habitat International Coalition, as well as the Rise Africa Festival, thank you, and see you soon, hopefully.